the members' room there will be served some drinks. Furthermore, we have on Twitter a hashtag going on. So if you want to Twitter about the debate tonight, you can use P versus J to tweet about the debate. Then I will give now the word to Matt McAllester.
Thank you. This one's working, I can hear. Okay. We're missing two panelists. I saw Geoffrey Robertson come in and then perhaps go out.
Maybe he's downstairs.
Maybe
I
he's
saw
downstairs.
him going down, actually.
We will just begin. Seeing as he came into the film in the middle, perhaps he can join the discussion in the middle. I just want to reiterate that we do not have to go Dutch this evening on the drinks. The embassy of Holland has been extremely kind, and we can all have a drink downstairs afterwards. I'm sorry for, I'm just trying to find something. Bear with me. Courtney Griffiths QC has represented, I'll just cut straight to the chase and I'll do these bios very quickly. Here's Geoffrey Robertson, thank you for joining us. Very quickly, Courtney Griffiths has represented, he knows of which he speaks. Thanks, Geoffrey. He's represented Charles Taylor at the ICC, and not only has he faced down the prosecutor, but also Naomi Campbell. Geoffrey Robertson QC has had a distinguished career as a trial and appellate counsel, an international judge and author of leading textbooks. I'm sure many of you know exactly who Geoffrey is. Barney Afako is a Ugandan lawyer and expert on transitional justice. He's practiced law and worked in conflict resolutions in Uganda, Zimbabwe, and the United Kingdom. And I'll be asking him about a particular encounter that he's had. Mugambi Kiai here serves as a program officer with the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa and the Africa Governance and Monitoring Project. Based in Nairobi, he's responsible for AfriMap monitoring, research and advocacy work around which East African involvement with the African Union mechanisms, as well as grant-making program for the Open Society. Klaartje, there was a gentleman that we saw in the film who said that local forms of justice and judiciary are superior to the ICC. Is he right?
Well, that's his opinion. But I think, well, of course, the opinions will differ about that. But I think the people I met in northern Uganda, in Gulu, you will encounter a lot of people, actually most people, that will say that.
Can you guys hear? Okay, good.
Okay, yeah.
Barney, you've met Joseph Kony.
Yes, a couple of times.
A couple of times. What's he like?
He's not crazy. He's very rational. I met him on behalf of the mediator when there were talks between the LRA and the government of Uganda. I was a legal advisor to the mediator, who's currently the vice president of South Sudan. My task was to go to explain to the LRA leadership what the mediator was proposing for a justice reconciliation package as part of the agreement. So this involved discussing international justice, the nature of the charges that they faced, but it also ended up being a discussion about the politics of international justice. And the LRA, especially Joseph Kony, thought that the intervention of the ICC was at the behest of President Museveni. and was because he was perceived as being vulnerable and weak, and he felt that he could not accept an external justice which was intended to humiliate him politically. And part of what we're trying to do in the mediation was to go back to the Rome Statute and its principle that states ought to go first, and unless they are unwilling or unable, there would not be ordinarily a place for international justice, and to sell to the LRA the option of having justice and reconciliation mechanisms in Uganda. So, but they grasped these issues, both the technical side of it, as well as their political take on it. So it is the case that these questions of justice are viewed through that lens, are viewed politically by insurgents, people caught up in conflict, as we saw in the film, also by people who feel that they're victims of the conflict. And that's a conversation that is ongoing. My own view is that international justice should be a justice of last resort, genuinely last resort. But I think that more recently the perception has been that it is an option of the powerful against the weak, and I think that's the terrain of this debate.
Did the indictment in Ocampo's relatively, as we saw in the film, it seemed relatively aggressive or insistent pursuit of this particular prosecution make things worse or make things more likely that Joseph Kony will face justice, or and that less people will be abducted, less people will die in that part of Africa?
No, I think the key dilemma is what came out towards the end of the film, to say that there is no relationship between the ICC's intervention and security on the ground. There is no capacity to make arrests. They rely on states parties. And who are the states parties? The key state parties, Uganda, in this. And what's the history of Uganda's ability to arrest the LRA? You had 20 years of failure. That's why there was cynicism about it. And indeed, I think that when Uganda referred the case, it wrongly thought that the international community would bring to bear its resources and firepower and put pressure on Sudan, but also send boots on the ground, and there would be a security solution. It was not looking for a justice solution. Uganda was looking for a security solution by making the referral. If they'd read the text and understood the architecture better, they would have realized that the onus and the duty to arrest was on them and not the international community out there in the abstract. So yes, it did complicate the discussion because suddenly you had people around the table worried about arrest, worried that this was all a trick, quoting his client Charles Taylor. This is from Joseph Kony to me, so it's not hearsay. I'll just become like Charles Taylor. Your national solution is not going to work. I'll become like Tom Alubanga in Congo, because we were in Congo at the time. He was one of the first people to be transferred to the ICC. So they're able to cite examples of individuals who are perceived to have been, if you like, booted up to the Hague for political reasons, and you can continue to cite examples of that today in other places.
And all the names you just mentioned and all the examples that you could cite, I think I'm right in saying, are African names. There are 30 indictees of the ICC and 8 what's called situations, areas that the ICC is, the prosecutors pursuing. In particular, they're all in Africa. Courtney, neocolonialism was a word that popped up in the film. Is that a legitimate criticism?
I certainly think so. My experience in defending Charles Taylor brought me to the position that international law isn't about law at all. It's about politics, and it's about the exercise of power. That's the reality of the situation. I remember when the United Kingdom became a signatory to the Rome Treaty, which established the ICC. Robin Cook, the then Foreign Secretary, was interviewed on Newsnight, and he was asked by his interrogator, well, Foreign Secretary, now that the United Kingdom has signed up to the Rome Treaty, Does it mean that the likes of Tony Blair and George Bush might be indicted for the illegal war in Iraq? And he turned on his interrogator indignantly and said, "This is not a court set up to try the likes of the Prime Minister of England or presidents of the United States." So who's it set up for? It's set up for those so-called lesser breeds without the law. And in reality on the ground, that is what has transpired. And if you look at virtually every situation in which the ICC are involved, you can see certain Western interests at play. And what we have to realize is that the language of human rights and humanitarian intervention has now become a fig leaf behind which powerful Western countries can intervene around the world to protect their own, particularly economic interests. The most recent example, France's intervention in Mali. What the French president doesn't say to the world is, guess what? The majority of our power comes from nuclear energy. And guess what? There just happens to be loads of uranium in Mali and next door in Niger. Why not? And that's the politics behind it. Let's just put it to the test. How many people in this room think that the war in Iraq was illegitimate and illegal? Hands up, please. How many of you think Tony Blair or President Bush would ever be put on trial in an international tribunal? Hands up. It's never going to happen, because the bottom line is the reality of international criminal law, as currently practiced, means that the powerful go unindicted. That's the reality of the situation. That to me is not law, because when I studied it, I was taught that whether you're princess or prostitute, whether you're the president of the United States or the president of Liberia, the law is above you. That is just not the case.
Geoffrey, is Courtney right?
No, he's not, on a number of grounds. Firstly, if you prosecute some mass murderers, the mass murderers that you can catch, but other mass murderers elsewhere in the world go free, should you free the mass murderer that you can catch? Should you let Joseph Kony go free? Should you let those who were responsible for the Holocaust? We should never have had Nuremberg. Should we just give up? I don't think we should. I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Let me explain. Nuremberg was the first case in which international criminal justice, not the ICC, but the idea that some crimes were so appalling, so murderous and racist or torturous, that those who were primarily responsible for them should be prosecuted. It's the one thing that we can do, having lost our belief in God, although many people in the film seem to believe in him, that justice must be faced on this earth and not in heaven or hell. And people seem to have mainly lost their belief in hell. So we proceed to attempt to construct, after the idea of universal criminal justice has gone into cold storage in the Cold War, and people like Pinochet. I remember when I joined Amnesty International, my first job in the 70s was to write, "Dear President Pinochet, will you please close the torture camps," and so forth, because he made no secret of his torturing. And it was 25 years before I was able to write the Human Rights Watch brief to the House of Lords after Pinochet was apprehended. So there is a kind of optimism, I think, that we can, in some cases, arrest, prosecute, and jail for life those who are responsible for genocide, for mass torture, and for mass murder. They're not all from Africa. International criminal justice began at Nuremberg with the Germans. It went on to Tokyo with the Japanese. It resurged 50 years later after the Cold War in the Balkans We dealt with Milosevic and with, at the moment, Karadzic and Mladic. They're not Africans. We had opened a court in Cambodia. They're not Africans. We had international courts in Timor. They're not Africans. So international justice is, while the ICC, which is the last of the international courts, has been primarily focused on Africa, that international justice hasn't been. The ICC has been primarily focused on Africa because Africa has asked it. It was the president of Uganda who invited the ICC in. It was the Kenyans, or at least Kofi Annan, who invited the ICC in. It was the Central African Republic that invited the ICC in. So the fact that barbarities happen in Africa, and it happens that the ICC has a mandate to deal with them via the, in recent cases, in the case of Bashir and the case of Gaddafi, as a result of a Security Council resolution putting it in the ICC's hands, then you can't say that it's a neo-colonial court. It goes where the Security Council directs it or where those who sign up to the treaty invite it in. On the other hand, the struggle to make global justice meaningful is long and difficult because, as you saw in the film, I think the film was a terrific film because it actually showed the difficulties of delivering justice, the dangers of raising expectations. It is a struggle. You might have seen Angelina Jolie the other day with all those men all solemnly swearing to do something about rape in the Congo. Russia represented, China represented, America with John Kerry, all there grinning at Angelina Jolie. And none of them, of course, members of the International Criminal Court, none of them paying for the money that it will take and the work that it will take to begin to take the stories of those victims of rape. So, yes, we won't probably get Blair, although Dr. Kissinger's travel plans are very curtailed, so are George Bush's. There are a lot of places they can't go to. Why? Because of international justice. Mr. Blair might too find that he can't go to. He can always go to Turkmenistan and various countries like that where he seems to advise. But yes, the travel plans of these people will, as time goes by and as universal justice values get adopted by individual states, may be diminished. The precedents, and this is, I think, is important for lawyers at least, and not unimportant for victims, the law of war is being affected by international justice. International precedents are affecting the way wars are fought more humanely, insofar as you can fight a war humanely at all. Targeting decisions are being affected by international justice decisions. So I don't despair, but I accept that there's a long way to go, and an ability to frighten, and it's clear that people like Joseph Kony are frightened, is an important thing. On the other hand, there are problems, particularly the problem of the ICC not investigating the Ugandan army, which was certainly guilty of a number of crimes.
Yeah, and that was also one of the reasons why people in Uganda were also very much against the ICC, maybe for the people here, because the army basically also committed crimes against humanity. So they felt they're very biased, the ICC. They're just against the LRA.
Yes, it was certainly a mistake for the prosecutor to go and give a press conference with the president. It looked, that was dreadful, and then of course it hasn't looked at all at the crimes committed by the army.
Yeah, but Geoffrey, how do you explain that selectivity which appears to be at the very heart of the way in which international justice is dispensed? Not only in Uganda, let's take Côte d'Ivoire. Gbagbo, one side of the conflict, is arrested and flown off to The Hague to be tried. Ouattara, former UN employee, i.e. a friend of the West, no indictment against him. How do you explain that selectivity?
Well, I would say, Courtney, that not yet. At least when Gbagbo was met in The Hague, the prosecutor issued a statement saying this is just a beginning. Gbagbo's troops, and allegedly, and one has to say allegedly because the prosecution is very often wrong, alleges that Gbagbo gave the order to actually fire into the UN compound, so it's actually killing peacekeepers. On the other hand, Otero, certainly there's a lot of evidence that he gave orders, or at least didn't punish, and this is the key to command responsibility theory, didn't punish members of his own forces who killed hundreds, if not several thousand, of civilians who were in areas that supported Gbagbo. So the acid test for the ICC in that case will be whether it does indict either Otero or some of his commanders.
Geoffrey, you talked about people who found it difficult to go to certain countries. Mugambi, the president of Kenya, is an indictee. But how should foreign governments deal with a key African leader who is facing these charges?
I think I'll start perhaps where Courtney, one of the processes he took is when he was learning law, it wasn't about princess or prostitute, it was about all of us. We've got to be very careful with the ICC question in Kenya because, and I think the ICC question in general, there's no single narrative about it. But I think if we don't focus on perhaps some of its more blatant and manifest inadequacies, you will see that what we're looking for is accountability, and that's all we've been asking for in Kenya. And also just being familiar with the Uganda story, it's the same story. You cannot indict Kony and not perhaps also look into UPDF, the Uganda People's Defense Force. You cannot do that. You cannot look at you cannot look at Kenya and say, hey, it's a closed case. The Kenya case is unique in the following manner, that yes, there's an election of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto as a new president and deputy president, but accountability cannot stop here. It cannot stop because the message that will be going is that if you're mighty, then forget justice, forget accountability. So we must soldier on in that case. But I also beg to deepen this a bit by asking, where is it that we're looking at the ICC as a panacea, as the vehicle through which we get justice, that we define justice through ICC? Because for a lot of these people, and you saw that in Gulu, The Hague is so far off. They only catch, 3, 4, yet this is a machine, it's a juggernaut. Where are the domestic remedies that we so need? And this is part of the question. In Kenya now we're being told, we have a new judiciary, we've got a new constitution. That's all hogwash. They're not doing enough to transform the political conversation that transforms all of these historical injustices into good governance, into a political method that respects rights, respects values, respects dignity. That is not the conversation that's going on. And that's a tragedy, because we're focusing on what I call superficial conversations. Peace versus justice. Who says they're exclusive? Who says they're mutually exclusive? And this, I think, I want to hear both. It's very interesting to see Courtney and this whole discussion go on, because there's no one single narrative. Please, listen to what, as you said, the prostitute has to say. And the prostitute in this case is a person who is helpless. The people of Kenya, there was, 1,113 who died per the last iteration of violence. In 1992, there was 1,500. Where is the justice for those people? They didn't have any. Kenya went to the criminal court, and I want to correct you. It was not Kofi Annan that took Kenya. Kenya we took ourselves there. And I'll tell you this. There was a political agreement that was made about Kenya in post-election, part of the post-election agreement, which said, if you do not form a special mechanism, because we are so used to impunity, if we don't form a special mechanism where justice is not only done, but seen to be done, then the ICC can come in. It was a political agreement. And you know what? William Ruto, in one of his, he was stamping around in his heartland, in Rift Valley. He went and said, you know, what is this ICC? We hear it's going to be coming. 90 years. He gave it 90 years. So when we went to Parliament, they said, don't be vague, let's go to The Hague. It was his people. It was Uhuru Kenyatta's people. They were a majority in Parliament. And you know what? As you can see, they're very popular. Now that we went to The Hague, it became inconvenient. The Hague kicks back, it became inconvenient. And that's just the truth. You will hear there's a narrative of spin that this is a colonial agenda, a neo-colonial agenda. And the ICC has not been very smart. They've not been politically smart about how you do that, how to deal with that narrative. It's been part of the colonial history where you don't privilege some of these narratives that are very profound to societies in which we come from. I think that is a given. But those are practical inadequacies. The principle of accountability should never be lost. Should never be. Charles Taylor had victims. I think it was not just him. There's so many others. And so this is not just about, again, the people before the ICC. There are many more warlords, not just in Africa, but across the world. So these are some of the narratives we've got to confront. But I agree, if we decide to throw the baby with the bathwater, what are you going to do about the people in Kiamba Church who William Ruto said they were cooking and the gas burst? There's no gas. There are no gas tanks in Kiamba Church. This is like in Gulu. They cook with firewood. I was there 3 weeks before. The men go back, they till the land and take off. Their families are not there. This was an atrocity from post-election violence. And you're telling me that they will never get justice? Because I can assure you, an Uhuru Kenyatta presidency, a William Ruto vice presidency will never ever set up local mechanisms. I know that for sure. They never will do it. So tell me in Kenya, they're going to get justice, because I don't see it. In Uganda, where Barney is talking about, if we only go against Kony, and part of the problem, again, was Moreno Ocampo. I think we need to be fair here. He had a problem in terms of how he executed mandates. It wasn't just the press conference. It was, again, equating the arrest of Kony to peace. It cannot be. It cannot be. Women have been raped. Children have been taken. It's a much more nuanced, it's a much more complicated, much more complex process. And yes, all of these conversations eventually lead to one conclusion, that we must abide by the principle. And it cannot be in our lifetimes that we see absolute peace. But we must understand that it's much more about progress and not perfection. If you're looking for perfection, forget it. Because these crimes are not perfect, and neither are the remedies.
I'm sure there are many questions in the audience. If anyone would like to ask any of our esteemed panelists a question, do let... Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm a former intelligence analyst in the UK Customs Service, and I've been following issues in Uganda since late 1998. In other words, before Victor moved his headquarters to Uganda from the UAE. My question is, just two quick questions. One, in regards to the tactics of actually trying to intercept the LRA, are the forests we saw at the end of the film, are they so densely foliated all year round? I presume they are, given the climate. And the second point is, what significance, if any, for putting pressure on the neighbouring countries do you think the appointment of Mrs. Mary Robinson as the UN Special Representative for the Great Lakes region will be? I would have to point out I am slightly sceptical there. People may remember that when in Mrs. Robinson's Ireland, a very powerful institution, the Catholic Church, was able to sexually abuse children with impunity from the criminal justice system for the very simple reason that the institutions of the country were scared stiff of the Catholic Church.
Anyone want to pick up on that? Another question, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for the film and for the really interesting debate. Looking at this issue, I sometimes get the sense that people seem to equate the office of the prosecutor with the International Criminal Court in general, and I feel like
So
sometimes
does the Office of the Prosecutor.
I just feel like
Sorry.
sometimes we overlook the fact that just because you initiate a prosecution doesn't mean that you're going to secure a conviction. And so, most recently, in the light of the Shui acquittal, isn't there hope as well that the judges are going to do their jobs and not just, rubber stamp prosecutions that are brought by the OTP if the evidence isn't there to back it up?
I think they're still on probation on that one, in terms of how they deal with these cases. And I think that I'm always worried about this aspect of international justice, the ICC in particular. If you set up a court for the purpose of setting an example, ensuring that these crimes don't go unpunished, the logic and the rationale behind it drifts inexorably towards convictions. And a quitting international court is not doing its job if its job is to deter. That's my difficulty with international justice, and where I'd rather take my own chances, if I were the one, with domestic justice. Because I think if a domestic court had the motto that the judges must set an example of criminals so that others don't commit the same crimes, we would be very worried about this. It's for me a design issue in international justice, that very often once you start being arrested, arraigned, the perception is that there's a high likelihood that you're going to be convicted.
The prosecution-mindedness of international justice is, and always has been, a problem, along with the inordinate delay in bringing trials on and the expense. And these are issues that have to be faced in practical ways. At Nuremberg, for example, the British Bar Council declared in all its puffed-up solemnity that no British barrister should represent a Nazi. So, seriously, that was a declaration of the British Bar. And so the Nazis at Nuremberg were very badly represented, the prosecution and the judges, and tended to live in the same hotel and mingle. And that was how the ICTY started. They had a prosecutor who made all the statements, they had judges who didn't say anything, and they had a registrar who should, in fact, have taken more responsibility. But there was no defense office. The defense weren't equal. And it was only in more recent courts that, and not yet in the ICC has a defense office, and that's a start, but it's not equal to the prosecutor. And we had a very bad case in Libya where the prosecutor charged in and said, "Oh, yes, Libya, you can try the young Gaddafi." It was extraordinary because it wasn't for him to say, it was for the court to rule. We all know that Gaddafi's is going to swing if he's tried in Libya, which doesn't have a proper court system to try him, and that he should be tried in the ICC for that reason alone. So there are real problems with a perception of bias. But the ICTY judges have been acquitting. The appeal court has overturned convictions in the Jokers 3 case, and then more recently, to the fury of the Serbs, the Gotovina case, the Croatian general. So there are acquittals, and those acquittals are to some extent reassuring, but international courts have to develop so that they have a defense office which is an organ of the court of equal weight to the prosecution.
Yeah, on that question, actually, I think the whole design of the ICC, with its different wings, the Office of the Prosecutor, the registry has done a very good job as well in terms of outreach. I think if you look at what we saw in the film, it comes much later. And the whole question of an expectation that the ICC will deliver, you cannot define justice as just, a conviction. There must be more than that. I think that's what we're getting back from people. So, you had a prosecutor, for example, in Moreno Ocampo, who was larger than life in terms of when he comes to Kenya, he takes over the whole headlines without thinking that it's bigger than this. So I agree with you in that sense, but it's also a part of the institutional architecture that has to be looked at if the ICC is going to continue being seen as a viable means through which we get something back out of. So I actually do buy into Barney's argument, and it's one of the problems we've had to confront, because as soon as he's labeled as, I don't know if you heard this one where it was Ocampo, Obama, and Odinga. In Kenya, what they did was to show that there was a neo-colonial agenda. Was Uhuru Kenyatta's biggest opponent is Raila Odinga, whose name starts with an O. He comes from the Luo community, from which Obama's father, who's from Kenya, comes from. So Obama. So you've got the two O's. Then you've got Ocampo. So very, very quickly they said, look at the O agenda, which was the imperial agenda. Obama does not want his cousin, again, remember ethnicity plays a big part, his cousin to lose the political battle. So he talks to Ocampo. And that narrative became the O agenda, and it played out. And it sounds ridiculous, but the O agenda at some point was a very, very effective tool to say there is an agenda to choose your next leader, who would be an O in the name of the same way Obama is the president of the US. These are some of the things that I think proper messaging and proper architecture of the ICC would have avoided totally. So there you go.
Yeah, right here, right at the front.
Thanks. It was uranium was mentioned in Mali, and we think of Iraq and we think of oil. So I'm sitting here wondering, as no expert at all in Uganda, what sort of major resources specifically might be present in the lands where Joseph Kony has sway?
Well, let's just think about it for a minute. Part of the debate which is never highlighted around situations like Darfur, and to this extent, I think Marx still has something to teach us. Start with what's happening at an economic level. So in the debate about Darfur, for example, one thing the various Hollywood actors who've run out there to publicize undoubted atrocities which took place there is the fact that Darfur just happens to sit on a sea of oil, which the West want. And they're afraid it might fall into the hands of the Chinese. Likewise, the majority of the indictees at the ICC are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which just happens to be one of the most minerally rich countries on the planet. And whilst all of that disorder is going on, the country is being raped by the Chinese, Western companies, and other interests. Charles Taylor told me, let me start somewhere else. Around the Gulf of Guinea, starting in Equatorial Guinea, going all the way around, possibly as far as Gambia, is an oil-bearing strata offshore. Ghana is just beginning to pump oil off its shores. Charles Taylor told me that Halliburton wanted to exploit and get the concessions to drill for oil off the coast of Liberia, and which offering him a pittance. The Chinese were willing to offer him more. He tells me he's playing tennis one day, and a senior executive from Halliburton called him and said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry I cannot protect you anymore." That's the bottom line. So look at what's happening at that economic level in each of these situations, and look at the selectivity with which the ICC approaches its task. So that, ask yourself the question, why were the ICC so quick, well, through the Security Council, to indict Gaddafi, but not Mubarak, not Assad? Why? Why? How do you account for that selectivity? How do you account for the fact that we have this mental contradiction? When a child soldier hacks off an arm in Liberia, it's a war crime. But when somebody sits in a bunker in Arizona, controlling a drone in Pakistan, which kills children and women, pregnant women. Why do we regard one as a crime and not the other? Why don't we view the other with the same revulsion? Why the double standards?
And can I quickly say that there is oil in Acholi, in Betty Bigombe's constituency, who was speaking. There is oil, and right now the argument between the communities and the state is about what's going to happen with the oil, because they feel they're being locked out of that process. That's just fact.
But if there is some conspiracy theory to be spun here, how do you account for the hatred by the Bush administration of the ICC? A hatred which reached such a puerile extent that they actually passed the Bomb the Hague bill, in which Jesse Helms was the proponent and gave the American president power to authorize force to release any American who was captured by the International Criminal Court. This is the reality, that it's not, you can't draw a clear line between the indictments of the ICC and the political machinations of America. Undoubtedly, when only about 500 decent demonstrators, in the sense that they weren't motivated by Al-Qaeda or anything else, but they wanted a bit more democracy in Syria. Only about 500 of them had been killed. The banners of their courageous supporters went up, El-Assad to the Hague. There is this demand, almost quest and desire to see mass murderers or those who give the orders to shoot punished. And I don't think that that can be clearly linked to the desire of Halliburton for oil, given that the Dick Cheney was certainly one of the most vigorous opponents of the ICC. I think it's more complicated.
I'm going to take a question from the back.
Hi. I was born and bred in northern Uganda. I want to ask the experts why Museveni and his regime cannot be indicted to be tried in Hague, and yet International Criminal Court found him guilty of looting and killing, raping women in Congo. Not coined, but he was taken to court and he was fined a hell of money. Why could he not be taken to court, to Hague, to be tried? Museveni committed crime in Luero Triangle for many, many, many years, and including genocide in northern Uganda. Why Con? Before, these were way before Con was even there. Con was, I think, a school boy in 1986, since 1986. Con, I think, came around, who knows? Who can tell me when Con came around? I think in 1995. But Museveni was already there committing crime in northern Uganda, genocide, not just crime, killing Chuli. And nobody is talking about that it should be taken to Hague.
Who wants to take that one?
And my second point, sorry, can I add on?
Well, could I just say that
while he was in
there is an answer to you, in the sense that I think the position is that the state of Uganda, in a sense, has been referred to the ICC. So there is nothing to stop the ICC from prosecuting. But they won't. In reality, they won't.
Okay, thank you,
No,
sir.
but they
on
were
that
asked
note,
by
on that
Museveni
note, can I say
to
one
interfere.
thing?
So
Yes,
they're
but
not
it's a
gonna
reference. It's a reference.
It's a reference, but then the ICC is not going to indict the one who is asking.
Well, it theoretically could.
Yeah.
Theoretically, it could. It has got the jurisdiction to do so.
Yeah, but it was their first case, so they're also,
Sure.
you're not going to do
Yeah.
that probably.
No, I agree.
We have time for one
Okay.
more
On that
question
note, let me just
at the
add,
back.
On that note, Museveni recently dismissed ICC in the Kenya's case.
Yep.
If he changes his political will the ICC withdraw the warrants again, Con?
Could answer that.
Yeah, sure.
I was
Briefly,
actually-
and then we'll take
okay.
one
I was
last
actually
one.
looking at Barney. He should be more of a Uganda expert than I am. Just a few quick points about Uganda, which, as I say, we have a very active interest in. One is the message that northern Uganda is just about Kony is false. It is false. Take it from me. And you know, I love the documentary, but there needs to be the narrative about the abuses that have gone on for the people of northern. They have lived in concentration camps for 20 years. It is a fact.
That was in
so,
the
so
beginning.
yes. So I'm not criticizing them. Yeah. I'm just saying there needs to be that should be. These are multiple narratives, my people. There are multiple narratives. We've got to tell all of them. So I hear the pain of people who have also been victims of the Uganda People's Defense Force, who are not, in a sense, getting any change from the ICC process. I hear that. But beyond that is there's no attempt for any political solution for Uganda. The ICC cannot be your political fix for Uganda. I'm sorry. The ICC only takes the elephants. The rest, the grass, what happens to the grass? So this has got, we've got to tell, and I hear when Courtney talks about the Charles Taylor issue with economic, the whole economic argument. So there is inadequacy, there are incompetencies that we must address about the practice rather than the principle of the ICC. So let's be clear about what we are talking about here. And for us, we're not surprised to see, for Museveni to speak at the inauguration of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto tells you that there's a circling of the wagons among African leaders so that accountability is not dealt with. And it should put you on notice. The fight back has just started. This is a new chapter that will delegitimize the whole question of the ICC in Africa. The question is, yes, if we then do away with the ICC, where will people look to and say, at least we have hope? Because domestically, they're already being suffocated and stifled to a place where they cannot even aspire for any justice. So I'm not saying the ICC is this. I'm just saying we need to A, nuance our analysis, and B, deepen our engagement around justice so that we can get domestic, international, and fair, equitable mechanisms both ways at both levels for justice. So that's all I think we need to be beginning to look at, because when you think about the person in Gulu, the person in Rift Valley in Kenya, or the person in central Kenya, all who are victims, I think you want to be saying one thing, that at some point, justice must be your shield and defender.
Last question, please.
Thanks. It's working. Thanks very much. Steve Crawford from Amnesty International. Can I first say, I have to say, I don't really recognize a description on Darfur and Eastern Congo, the idea of people jumping in to want to react. I think the people of both Darfur and Eastern Congo tell a very different story of the world not wanting to look at all to start with, and that was a great problem with politicians around the world. And it took some time before people woke up that human rights and other organizations were talking, and it took time to get that, and I would certainly welcome the fact that it happened. Going to the film and the themes, congratulations on what is very powerful in the challenges and the dilemmas that are faced. And we've seen, both within the film and discussion, a lot of the perceptions as well as the reality of the former prosecutor, who of course has now changed. And I'd be interested to hear from the panel, we now have what seems like a very powerful Gambian prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and be interested to hear from you whether we feel that that what seems to me rather false narrative of the idea of the outsiders coming in and doing things will be changed and helped by the woman prosecutor from Gambia, Fatou Bensouda, who's now there.
I think my quick response to that is the narrative won't change. As the campaigns went on, and someone who was very close to Uhuru Kenyatta's camp had a conversation with me when I said, Fatou Bensouda is talking about deaths of witnesses, huge interference. He looked at me and said, Fatou Bensouda? She worked for Yahya Jammeh. Why would we give any credit to what she says? Again, let's remember this. This is about people's survival, political careers, survival for a lot of these people. So the narrative will be to make sure that she is legitimized in the eyes of the public as possible. But I think it's a good thing that you've got a prosecutor from Africa. I think it's a good thing, because it's a start for beginning perhaps to debunk this spin around imperialism. I think it's a good place, but a lot more work has to be done, because even for a lot of these people, they find places from which to perhaps begin pushing the fact that the credibility of this person, rather than anything else is also wanting.
Fatou Bensouda's appointment was purely political. The ICC was coming under serious criticism for being neo-colonialist in the way that it was approaching its mandate. And what better way to say, we're not after you blackies alone, than to appoint an African as the prosecutor. Then you can't turn around and say you're racist, because then the other side, well, look who's prosecuting you. It's an African. That's the bottom line on that.
On that note, I think that's a very good way to end and encourage barroom conversation. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, and you came a long way, and Courtney came from South London, which he said was an adventure in itself. And thank you so much to the Dutch Embassy, and on behalf of Time and the Frontline and the Dutch Embassy, thank you very much for coming.
Well, just end it here.
That would be great.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.